the original Crossroads Mason Women's Ongoing Group. She was the vision team, and she works full-time, so she launched the PM group. So I got to hang out with her and get to know her through that. And then some of you may have seen Robin shared a very impactful story over the Spark series. If you missed it, there's going to be a link to it in the blog post that we'll send out to you. So on the website, how we do the study questions and the links to the John movie, there's going to be a link at the very bottom to her talk that she shared over the Spark series, and I highly, highly, highly recommend that you check that out. But with that being said, here you go, Robin. Thank you.
I have one?
Oh yeah, you're
I'm
good.
Yeah.
And my coffee, my journal.
And I'm going to sit just because I feel more at home that way and not quite so nervous. And you would think that, Deanna asked me earlier, well, this is probably nothing, like after you spoke on the stage in the auditorium. But actually, this makes me a little more nervous because if you're on the stage in the auditorium, it's pitch black. You don't have to make eye contact with anybody. You don't even know if they're listening or sleeping. So you just can talk. So when I make eye contact, please just smile at me, don't make a face like what you're talking about, because that'll scare me. Oh, and that will help a lot. So, as Deanna shared with you, I've spoken openly about my story. I have a lot of trauma in my childhood, a lot of sexual trauma. My grandfather was a predator who trafficked me. And when I got into my 30s, kids find a way to, I survived, okay? And there's a little bit more about that in the video, but in my 30s, I became very depressed. And I realized that all that stuff that I thought was kind of tucked away under control was affecting the way I live every day. And so I started to think about, I had never done any counseling. So lived through that, got into my mid-30s, and I'm thinking, maybe it's time for me to do a little healing work, just a little. So I had a little breakdown in my car one day, which I talked about in the video, and then got connected with a counselor, and we began a journey that I am still on, I will say. There were, 8 or 9 years of pretty intensive work, seeing him every week for 5 years. And then, we stretch it out to a couple weeks and then a month. And I still call occasionally when something comes up because I've learned to identify what's going on inside me. And I have decided, I've made the choice that I want to deal with it when it comes up, that I don't want to let it fester and sit. And so along that journey, I have learned some things about healing and about what works for me. And I know that everybody's situation is different. And when we're looking into the book of John here, we're hearing about, we're seeing Jesus do these miraculous physical healings. And I think there also was some emotional healing happening, because I don't think that you spend your life physically ill without having some emotional repercussions. We are tied together, body, spirit, and emotion, mind. So I think, I know that my emotional woundedness affected me physically, and still dealing with some stuff from that. So we're tied together. And so I want to look first at Jesus, like his miracles from an overarching, like an over perspective, like this umbrella that not just in the book of John, but in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, where we are seeing, they've written down for us the stories of Jesus doing all these miraculous things. And not just physical healings and emotional healings, but feeding people and things that we know didn't happen in the ordinary world, that they were spiritual in nature and that Jesus was involved. So the first thing, just a drink of water. I want to look at this theme that Jesus that we can see in his ministry. He would start with something that was simple, everyday item, like a seed, like a sheep, a coin. He would start with something in the physical realm, and then he would tell a story or teach something that always directed people toward the spiritual world. So there was I think every time he teaches, he starts out in the physical realm, he's talking about things that we all know about and understand, and then he shifts over to this spiritual perspective. And the thing that goes with it is these physical things are temporal. They have a beginning and an end. They belong here on earth. And he's always shifting us from that perspective over to things that are eternal and that build the kingdom that's outside of this world. So his whole ministry is about that. All through those books are called the Gospels. All through the Gospels, he's moving us from temporary to eternal, from physical to spiritual. Whatever the lesson he's teaching is, it follows that pattern. So I want to look at these chapters of John in that context, like the way that Jesus was moving people from the physical world to the spiritual world. And I know that this week's reading was chapter 5 and 6, but I'm going to go back to chapter 4 for just a minute, because this story of the woman at the well in chapter 4 is one of my favorite stories in the whole Bible, because I see myself in her. She came to the well at noon. I don't know if you realize that. Noon was not the customary time to get water from the well. Typically, women would go to the well early in the morning when it was cool, because they had to carry the water back. And nobody wants to do that in the desert at noon. And it was also customarily a social time for the women. They would come out to the well and they would talk and chat and talk about their kids and their chores and whatever. And here's this woman at the well at noon by herself. So that tells me something about her. And we go on and we read about her past, that she's had 5 husbands, that she's living with someone who's not her husband. And I think that the reason she came to the well at noon by herself was because she probably carried shame from her lifestyle, from the choices that she made, and probably the way that she would have been treated in the community. She would more or less have been looked at like a prostitute. So she comes to the well by herself at noon, and she finds Jesus already waiting there, which I think is really cool. He has taken a shortcut through her town and is sitting at the well waiting when she comes. And I think Jesus is always waiting for us in some space. When we are ready to go and talk to him and talk about our stuff, and the first thing he does, he talks to her a little bit and he speaks truth to her about her life. And I think Jesus is always waiting in a place to do that for us. So she comes to the well. I can imagine she was probably startled just to see anyone there. And then how she felt about a man being there when she was there alone, I don't know. It would have made me a little nervous with my history, And he speaks to her, which also was a really strange thing, because he was Jewish and she was Samaritan. And religious laws said that he wasn't even supposed to talk to her. So he speaks to her and he asks her for a drink of water. And she says, it's almost like, are you talking to me? Like, you're talking to me over here? She says, why are you, a Jew, asking me, a Samaritan, for water? And Jesus does this thing that he does so well. He changes the conversation from the water that's in the well to the living water that he is. And he says, if you knew who I was and what I have for you, you'd be asking me questions. I wouldn't be asking you. And those two things are really going to be, they're pivotal to healing in our lives. To know who God is and what he has for us. We're going to come back around to that in a minute. So I want to jump over then for a second to chapter 5, where Jesus meets the man at the pool of Bethesda. And my husband and I were fortunate enough, last year we got to go to Israel, which was really cool. If you ever have the opportunity to go, sell your children, go. Whatever you have to do to get there. Sell your furniture, your car. Probably not your kids, but it was really cool. But one of the stops that we made was at this pool of Bethesda. It's been excavated. It's still there. So we know historically that there's evidence this place existed. But what surprised me is how big it is. There are, it talks about the colonnades here, but there were levels, like up here, and then stairs down, and then the pool was down in the bottom. So there were all these like piazzas, I would say, like, just where people would come and sit. And if we look at this story in the King James Version of the Bible, we get a little more information than we do here in the NIV. But in the King James Version, it tells us that an angel would come and stir up the water, and then the first person to get in the water after the angel stirred it up would be healed. So it's a place where people came for healing. They would, and there were big flat expanses of grass, and believe that those were the porches, and that's where people would just lay all day and wait for the angel to come. So this guy has been sick for 38 years, and I don't know how many times he's been to the pool. I would imagine he probably just hung out there a lot because he wasn't mobile. And I want you to notice there's an interesting thing here that is going to help us a little bit later. Jesus comes up to him, and so think about this. He's at the pool where healing happens all the time. Jesus walks up to him, and the first thing that Jesus says is, "Do you want to be well?" I'm like, okay, that's like walking into the emergency room where someone's sitting bleeding and saying, "Is there something we can do to help you?" I mean, it's like, duh. That's what I pictured this man going like, "Well, yeah, I'm here. I'm here at the pool, and I'm waiting for the angel to come." And what he says is, "I don't have anyone to help me get into the water." And so I want us to notice that community is important when we are healing. It's really important. I don't know how long this guy had been laying there, and I think this is true physically or emotionally. If you are ill, if you are carrying things that hurt, you need people around you who can support you in that, who can come alongside you and do tasks that you don't feel like doing, who can say, "How did your week go? Did you meet with your counselor?" You need that around you. And I think we see that right here in this story. So Jesus then does something this is another thing that Jesus does a lot of. He asks the man, "Do you want to be healed?" And he says, "Yeah, yeah, I do. I'm here. That's why I'm here." And Jesus says, "Pick up your mat and walk," which seems like a really simple thing. But it was the Sabbath day, and picking up your mat was actually against the law. And this man, the punishment for that, I did a little research about the history, punishment for that was a whipping in the synagogue. So Jesus says to this guy, "Well, do you want to be healed? Okay, pick up your mat." So really, he's asking him to do a hard thing. He's asking him to do something that's outside of his ordinary, that might even cause a little consternation in his life or a little trouble. But Jesus says, "Do you want to be well? Then do this." And I think that we need to be really in tune with what God's asking us to do when we're seeking healing. He might ask us to do some things that are difficult, right? When I began seeing a counselor, a lot of my memories were just kind of locked away. And I wasn't thinking about them all the time in my everyday life. I was just sad and depressed. And I didn't really have a place that I could say, "Oh, I know where that's coming from." But as I began to process through the healing, the memories actually became worse before they got better. I started to have nightmares and night terrors, and more than one time I just wanted to quit. It was hard. And I didn't want to keep walking through that. And honestly, there were days that I grit my teeth to get in the car and drive to the counseling because I knew it was going to be painful. But what I also knew that was on the other side of that pain was some freedom. And so it's necessary sometimes for us to do hard and difficult things. And you know what? Jesus wouldn't ask you to do it if you couldn't. He doesn't ask you to do things that he's not equipped equipping you. And I think in the movement, in the man making the choice to pick up his mat, I think he probably received some supernatural, like in his obedience came this healing. And I think we have to, from this, we can learn that we have to be really intentional about our healing. You do not get healed accidentally. It's not just going to drop out of the sky into your life. Now, God is definitely going to put things in place for you that help you move that direction. I think he will move mountains for you, actually, when you start moving toward him. But I just want us to kind of be aware of like what's happening here in the story, that was a really hard thing for the man to do. And then when he gets to the temple later, they ask him, and this is interesting to me too, instead of asking him, why are you walking? What happened here? They ask him, why are you carrying your mat? Okay, and there are going to be people like that in your life, maybe, who say, what are you doing that for? And you need to, I read something that I wrote down here. It's from a commentary, but it says, the author said, we who are healed by Christ's word should be ruled by it. And I really liked that. So Jesus' work in my life is healing me. So I want to be in tune with him. I don't want to be listening to what other people around me are saying. Like, what are you doing? Carrying your mat? I don't need that. I need to be in tune with Jesus, who's saying, pick it up and walk. I know you can. So I think that is really important for us to kind of take note of here. Now, we're going to jump over to, I forgot something. When the man went into the temple, and they're asking him, why are you carrying your mat? A few minutes later, we read that Jesus found the man. So in that, I would read Jesus was looking for him. And what he says to him is really interesting. He says, hey, you're well now. Stop sinning before you get sick again. So again, Jesus moves from this physical healing realm to the man's spiritual life. They're connected. And he's always moving us from that physical, temporal place into the spiritual realm where we see him at work. So even in this story, he did that. And now I want to look at chapter 6, where Jesus does a whole different kind of miracle. So at the woman in the well, he's met her. She's there by herself. There's no one else around. With this man at the pool of Bethesda, Jesus comes and finds him, and there's a crowd who's witnessing what's happening. In this miracle, where Jesus feeds people, it's the whole crowd. Everybody gets some of this, right? So they begin to, I'm not going to focus too much on the actual miracle itself, but what happened afterward. People started to follow him, right? He actually tries to get away from them to be by himself for a little while, and they find him. They come across the lake in the boat, and they, we're down several verses now, like 60 down in there, and they find him, and what he says to them is really interesting to me. He says, and I'm going to read this from, this is John. This is going to be from the Message version. It's 25, chapter 6, 25 to 27. Jesus, so they find him across the lake, and they're like, when did you get here? I mean, we've been looking all over for you. And he says, I tell you the truth. Actually, I'm going to read it from the Message. Jesus answered, you've come looking for me because you saw God in my actions. Not because you saw God in my actions, but because I fed you and filled your stomachs. So the question here is, why are we following? What do we really want? Do we want loaves or do we want life? What do we really want from Jesus when we encounter him? And what he says to them is, don't waste your energy striving for perishable food like that. Work for the food that sticks with you, food that nourishes lasting life, food that the Son of Man provides. He and what he does are guaranteed by God to last. So here again, he's talking to this crowd that he's fed. He's filled up their stomachs, and he's moving them from the physical realm to the spiritual realm. He says, this bread was really great, and I'm glad your stomach's full, but there's so much more than that. Let's look at it. Let's look into the spiritual realm. Let's see what God has for you there. Do you want just this? Just some bread, some loaves? Or do you want life? So that's a really important question. What do we really want from Jesus? So now I have like 5 minutes. Through these observations that we've made from these stories, I want to talk specifically about healing. Physical healing, emotional healing. It seems to me that it's really hard to grasp a hold of sometimes. I have a friend who just passed away from cancer. He was not even 50 yet, 48. 2 kids in college, loved Jesus with his whole heart. And we prayed for his healing, and he was anointed. And people came to their home and prayed over him. And he didn't receive a physical healing. And in my own story, I would have been really happy if God had just fixed everything and I didn't have to do 15 years of work. That's really what I wanted that to happen. But then, more particularly, 2 years ago, in January, so it's been 2 years now, I found a lump in my breast. And at the time, I wasn't too concerned. I had had some cysts and that had to be drained and all, so I wasn't too anxious about it. I had already had a mammogram scheduled, so I kept my regular appointment. And they sent me down. I showed the technician. I can feel it. It's right here. She says, "Oh, we're going to go down the hall and get an ultrasound." Okay, good. I've done that. It's okay. I'm not panicking yet. And then the technician's looking at the ultrasound, and he says, "Can you come back tomorrow morning for a biopsy?" And then I'm starting to feel a little nervous, like, what's going on here? And went back the next morning and got the biopsy. And of course, you have to wait, which is the worst, the waiting for the phone call. And I remember just saying to God, like, what the heck? I mean, really? Have I not had enough pain in my life? Really? We're going to do this now? And I heard God whisper to me, "I'm going to teach you what it means to be my daughter." That's all. No promise that the cancer is going to be okay, nothing else. Just, I'm going to teach you what it means to be my daughter. So that week on Friday, I got a phone call from the doctor, and the tumor was malignant. And while I'm, you get a phone call, you're processing that, and he's like babbling on about, I need to come in and make appointments, and I really didn't hear, like, someone will call you on, he said, someone will call you on Monday and repeat all of this to you. So he knew that I wasn't hearing. But, so that was on Friday. Saturday, my husband and I usually attend the Saturday night service here. We came in that weekend, and it happened to be the weekend that Brian and Libby Tome were on the stage talking about the miracle healing that Libby received. And I'm still like, my head's spinning a little bit from this tumor thing. And I'm sitting there listening, and this is really tapping my finger on the seat. And this thought came into my mind. Oh, so Libby Tome gets a miracle, and I get a tumor. And from that point, I wasn't planning to admit this, but from that point onward, I was mad at God, and the way that I showed him I was mad, I refused to pray for my own healing. Like, not doing it, not asking you for anything, because I felt like I was being cheated out of something good. And in that, when I look back now, what I realize is I had forgotten the question, do I know who God is? And do I know what he really has for me? And do I believe that that is working out for my best? So I think I just want to pull all these little pieces together. And what I would say to you is that if you have not come upon a really difficult thing in your life, You're going to, because we live here on earth where things are broken and bodies are sick and life is messy and people hurt us. So if you haven't experienced that, hallelujah, I'm really glad for you, but I think that you probably will before you get out of here. So I want to pull together a few pieces that kind of maybe can help us process when pain happens and when we really want to see a miracle. An instantaneous, right now, I'm healed and done with this, and we don't get that. Because I'm thinking about that pool of Bethesda. It was a huge place. There are people laying, probably hundreds of people laying there, and Jesus comes up to one man, and he gets the miracle. Everybody else came back the next day. So I want to just talk real briefly for a minute, like what do we do with that? I would call what I felt, disappointment. I would acknowledge now that it really was a disappointment with God. And sometimes we are kind of afraid to say that out loud. And I probably was at the time. I wouldn't have maybe said that. But looking back, I was really disappointed because I had done all this hard work and somehow I felt like I should have had an easy path from now on. You know, should have been that way. So I had this expectation. And then when God didn't measure up for me, I felt disappointment. So just for a brief minute, I want to talk about some things that can help us deal with that kind of disappointment. And it's going to be the questions that we talked about. So I want you to ask yourself these questions when you get in a difficult situation. First of all, do I have an eternal perspective? Am I only focused on what God is doing in this physical world, in the pain that I feel, in the people that don't like me, in the relationships that are messed up? Or can I see for the longer picture, the longer view? Can I see these things from an eternal perspective? Because that's the perspective that God sees them from. So it's important for us to move from this physical, temporal seeing of things into seeing them eternally and in the spiritual world and in the kingdom sense. So that's the first thing. The second one is ask yourself, what do I really want from God? Jesus asked that question, not just of the man at the pool, but in a few of the other Gospels, you'll see him ask people, do you want to be well? And I think what he's really saying is, what do you want from me? And if I look back at the moment when I was sitting in the sanctuary and I had that thought that Libby Tome gets a miracle and I get a tumor, what I really wanted to know was on a deeper level, does God love me as much as he loves Libby Tome? That's what I really wanted to know, because I was measuring his love for me by what good things he did for me. And I felt like he was withholding something. And you know, that is the oldest temptation in the Bible. Way back in Genesis, when the serpent came to talk to Eve and was tricking her, deceiving her into eating the fruit of the tree that God said, don't do this, you don't want it, it's not good for you. The serpent said to her, you know what, God just doesn't want you to know everything that he knows. He knows you'll be too much like him. He tricked her into believing that God was withholding some good thing from her. And a lot of times I think we get stuck in that same deception and we forget who God is and what he really has for us. So the third question that I want you to ask yourself, and this is kind of a more practical thing, do I put myself in a place to receive healing? Do I have a place where I meet up with Jesus, like the woman at the well? She had a place where she was alone and spent time with Jesus, and he was able to show her truth about herself. You need a place like that in your life, where you go regularly to spend time with Jesus and hear from him. Another thing you can do to put yourself in a place to receive, am I willing to hear truth when Jesus speaks it to me or when he uses someone else to speak it to me? I have this tendency to, especially when my husband wants to speak truth to me, I'm doing this la 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 la. That's really hard for me when he wants to use my husband to speak truth to me. So, but I need to continually be putting myself in a place where I'm open to hearing. I need to have community around me who are willing to do that. That's the third thing. Do you have community? And the fourth thing, am I willing to do some desperate things to receive healing? In the stories of healings, particularly in Mark, there's some stories where people did some really desperate things to get to Jesus. There's a woman who weaves through a crowd. She's got an issue of blood. She's been bleeding for 12 years, ladies. 12 years. And she's not even supposed to be in a crowd. She's like banned from the community. And she sneaks through the crowd and touches Jesus' garment and receives healing. That was a desperate act for her. She was breaking the law. She could have been stoned. But she was desperate enough for healing that she did the hard thing. I'm thinking about the 4 friends who brought their sick friend to Jesus. They cut a hole in the roof. That seems pretty desperate to me. And for you to be the sick person and allow your friends to lower you through it's pretty desperate, right? So I want us to ask ourselves, am I really willing to do the hard and desperate things that healing might take? And then the last question, do I apply practices and habits that I know will help me? And I'm thinking about like the man at the pool, and all of those people at the pool, they're going there, they're doing it every day. They have some practices and habits built in that brought them to a place where they could receive healing. And then one last question. What do I do when the teaching is hard? And in this is in chapter 6. I think this is one of the saddest verses in the Bible. So up in 60, it says, on hearing it, many of Jesus' disciples said, this is a hard teaching. Who can accept it? And then if you jump down to verse 66, from this time, many of his disciples turned back and no longer followed him. They said it was too hard. So I asked myself, what do I do when the teaching is hard? Do I turn back? No, I want to be like Peter, who in verse 68, Jesus says to him, do you want to leave too? And Simon Peter, I love him, he says, Lord, where else would I go? You have the words of eternal life. And what we see in Peter in that moment is that he has grasped the difference between the things that are physical and temporary. And he's gotten the concept. This is about eternity. You have the words of eternal life. And that's where I want to live. I want to live in that place. That is where I live. There is nowhere else for me to go but to Jesus. And I pray that for you and over your lives.